In this video, I'm going to be discussing the HSB limits in Easy Green Screen 8. What these are designed to do is to control the range of color that Easy Green Screen is going to extract. So that's the range of color of your green screen. Now, if this looks complicated and you don't really want to learn how to adjust these, then if you just use the default values, this is going to extract very similar to Easy Green Screen 7. So you can just use the defaults most of the time. And then if something needs touched up, you can go and do the old methods of touch up you were doing. However, if you want to learn these, this will give you the ability to automate more difficult extractions without having to touch up images. So to get started, we have to be in SRGB if you want to reference these colors to your actual file. And I'll just explain this here real quickly. I'm going to have to go into a little bit of color theory here, so I'll try to keep this basic, but you'll have to really understand this if you want to know what you're doing. So if I sample this green screen up in here, you see I've got right now a hue of 107, saturation 46, and brightness of 56. If I convert this to Adobe RGB, for example, and sample this same area of the screen, our hue was, what was it, 107 before? Our hue is now 93. Our saturation is a little bit lower, 42, where it was 46. And so in general, on a green screen, your hue is going to be significantly lower for Adobe RGB, and the saturation is also going to be a little bit lower. And so if you're trying to reference these to what you think you're adjusting, if you're in Adobe RGB, that is not going to work, because these are all referenced to SRGB, and Easy Green Screen is going to convert any images that are not sRGB to sRGB so it can apply these limits. So just make sure you're in sRGB if you're trying to adjust these. So what is HSB? Well, that's hue, saturation, and brightness. And the thing with a green screen, I think most people are familiar with RGB. That is, if you look in your channels, you've got red channel, green channel, and blue channel. That's what RGB is. And it mixes those intensities to get a color. HSB, on the other hand, it's hue, saturation, and brightness. And Adobe doesn't have specific HSB channels, but I was able to, with the latest version of Photoshop, convert RGB into sRGB internally in the plugin to be able to apply these values. So this is actually very handy, because if you look at, for instance, I've got a screen that's got a lot of variation here. But if you look at the bright areas, for example, the hue here is 139 in this brighter area of the screen. If I go to a very dark area, one of these shadows, the hue is 132. So the hue has not really changed much. Even when the pixel becomes almost black, our hue is around 133. And so you can see that too, in the saturation on this screen is all the way at 100, but whether we're dark or light, the saturation stays at 100, the hue stays about the same. So with a green screen, really the majority of the changes you see in lighting is just in the brightness, where the hue and saturation stay roughly the same within a given image on the same green screen. So we can use this to our advantage when trying to narrow down the range of color that it's going to extract. And what I'll tell you right off the bat too is don't adjust these unless you have to, because most often these values will give you best results in the hair if you leave the hue at 95 and don't increase that and leave the feather on. That's going to give you best results in the hair. The ones that you're free to adjust without affecting the hair too much, for sure this hue max, you can adjust that all you want. This won't affect the hair. The brightness, that's almost never going to affect the hair. And the saturation, as long as you stay below 50 or 60, it usually won't affect the hair. All right, so let me bring this back up here. So what this is telling Easy Green, or what Easy Green Screen is telling Photoshop, in our hue here, hues work on 0 to 360 degrees. And our greens are in the range of around, I would say 80-ish is when I would call it green, all the way up to around 160. That is your hues for green. And so by default, Easy Green Screen is going to extract any hues from 95 up to 160. That's the default range. But it's only going to extract those colors if the saturation is above 35%. So let's move this to a hue of 130, which is a typical value you see. 120 to 130 is the value, although this screen's a little bit lower, but 120 to 130 is the value for most screens. So let's say we've got this hue of 130, for instance. Right now, the defaults are saying don't extract that pixel if it gets below 20% brightness. So if it comes in this dark of green, it's not going to be extracted and it's going to be part of the foreground. It's also going to say don't extract it if the saturation goes below 35. So over here, even though our hue is still green, if the saturation drops below this threshold of 35, that pixel is not going to be extracted. So what we're really telling to do is extract this area of greens where it's the saturated greens and the brighter greens that are the greens of the screen. So if we just run, I'm going to turn the non-hair defringe off so we're not affecting these strings with the defringing. I'm just going to remove this screen here with the default values. This hopefully will make a little bit more sense in a moment. Okay, so you see that these tennis strings got extracted. So what can we do about that? Well, if we zoom in, and if you're going to use these, get used to using your color picker tool, at least until you understand what you're doing. Once you've done enough of these and you kind of know what to adjust, you can pretty much just go in and set these in, because you know you've seen enough of the images before. But while you're getting used to these, go in and make sure you're on a point sample, you're not on an average. But like for these tennis strings, go in and take a sample and see what the color actually is, so you'll know why it's being extracted. So for instance, right here, we've got a hue of 101, saturation of 58, and a brightness of 21. Well, the hue of 101, that falls within our green screen limits. Saturation of 58, that's above the minimum saturation requirements, and a brightness is above that 20% brightness as well. So these fall within the limits we're allowing to be extracted. And here we've got a brightness of 25%. So what we'd have to do is just change one of these values to not allow greens that are in this darkness range to be extracted. So if we move this up to 30%, for example, and rerun this, now you can see that our strings have not been extracted. I could probably get a little more if I go up to 35. Let's try that again. And by the way, if you rerun the extraction, as long as you have this original layer here, you don't have to actually undo your extraction. It's going to start over with this layer. And you can see that we got a little bit more back with 35. However, and those strings do look a little thicker. We got a little more of those back, but we did not erase all of the screen now. And the reason why is because that area of the screen the brightness on some of those pixels is, for instance, 33. So by pushing this up to 35, we now are telling it that that part of the screen is not going to be extracted. So if you have dark areas you need to recover, and you know you're going to in your photo shoot, try to make sure your screen is evenly lit, you don't have shadows or folds, and that gives you the most ability to adjust this brightness value, for example, without affecting the removal of your screen. So for example, on this image, if we try to run this brightness level at 30, it's probably not going to remove much of the screen because this entire screen was very dark. So if we reset this down to a limit of 20, for example, this is the default, by the way, we're not extracting all of the screen. Now, the one difference Easy Green Screen 7 does have versus 8 is 8 is not as aggressive with the defaults to remove the dark shadows. And it does not mean that Easy Green Screen 8 doesn't extract as well as 7. This is because this is where I set the defaults. Version 7, although most images are similar, when you get to these dark areas, it probably extracts, I don't know, I'm going to guess somewhere down around 12% brightness, maybe more. But what happens is when you start telling it to extract greens this dark, then any black clothing you have that has a little bit of green spill is that same color, and that starts getting extracted. So for example, these areas are almost black here. So if we look at the value of these pixels, and we're looking at a brightness of 7%. These truly are almost black. So if we wanted to fully extract all this, we would have to move this limit down to, let's say, 5. And so, yeah, that removed all of the green screen, but now you're removing these areas of this dark clothing that had green spill on it. Whereas you can see that this spill on this created a brightness of 6 within your green range. So the whole thing to take away from this is try to light your screen evenly and try to keep the screen brightness up at around 40 to 50% at least. And it's going to give you the most freedom to adjust this value. I think I'm going to cut this video off here. The brightness is the one that you're going to adjust more, but there's also use cases for these others too. So I don't want this video to drag on. I'm going to make another video next and discuss some of these other settings. So make sure to watch the next video in this series as well.